Hello guys, so welcome to our next session, and in today's session we're gonna take a look at aura event propagation in aura components. In the last session we looked at implementing application events and aura components. I hope you guys understood that, but in today's session we're gonna move on to event propagation, which is like how events move from your component to component when they are fired. So, in simple terms, when an event is fired from any component, the Aura framework follows a set rules or a set of procedures that moves the event from one component to another component. This movement itself is called event propagation. And this event propagation works differently for both component and application events. So, we're going to look at the component events first. So, the component event propagation works in two phases. So you need to remember that event propagation works in phases for both component and application events. It follows a different set of phases for the component and a different set of phases for the application event. So event propagation in your component event happens in these two phases. First one is called your capture phase, and the second one is called your bubble phase. And both of these phases occur in their order of appearing. What that means is first the capture phase happens for component events, and then the bubble phase happens. So, what is actually a capture and bubble phase? So, let us take this diagram as an example again. So let's say, we used this as an example in our last session. We had this component A, which had a child component B, and then the grandchild component D. So if you fire an event from this D component, and then it is a component event, it's going to move up the hierarchy. It's going to travel in the hierarchy, which is D to B to A. But the capture phase represents the movement of the event from the root, that is the topmost component, to the component which fired the event. So in our case, it says here in the diagram that component D fired the event. So the capture phase will go to the component A first, then to the component B, and then to the component D. So this moves from your top to bottom. Will start from your root component and keep on moving downwards until it reaches your source component or the component which fired the event. Then, after the capture phase is over, your component event travels from A to B to D. We move on to our next phase, which is called the bubble phase. So, just like bubbles, they go up, they float towards the water. That the same way the events move upwards in your bubble phases. And please note this bubble phase happens after the capture phase is finished. So your capture phase starts, your event goes from A to B to D, then your bubble phase will start, and then your event will go from your D to B and then to the topmost component, which is the A. So as you can see right here, your bubble phase is represented by D to B to A. Now, if I talk about the implementation of the events that we did in the last session, we don't know where to use these phases in. How do we use these phases? How do they travel? How do we specify which phase to use? So we'll take a look at it in today's session. So let me go back to our org and let me open the developer console. And let me open up the example that we set up in our last session. And we're going to open our parent. Then we're going to open our child. And then we're going to open our grandchild. And again, in order to display these, we'll open our application called the event testing application. So in the case of, since we're looking at component events first, I think we left it off to work with your uh, application events in our last example. So let me just take a minute and fix these back to using component events. So let me change the type of my event right here. Okay, let me make these changes off screen so that I don't waste your time. Alright guys, so I just made the changes for these components to be using the component event instead of the application one, but here is where comes the interesting part. So as you guys remember, we had three components, the parent, the child and the grandchild, which represented this hierarchy, the parent, the child and the grandchild. So in order to demonstrate the propagation of your events, what we are going to do is we are going to fire off our event from this grandchild component now, and you're going to see how the event travels by handling the event in all three of our components. So let me go back here. So we are already handling the event on our parent. I'm just going to make a little change here that I'm going to say parent. Okay, that's fine. And I'm going to just check if the event is being, so the event is not being handled on the child now, so let us handle the event in the child as well. And we're gonna move this register part from here to the grandchild like this. Now in the child controller, we want to move the code to fire the event from the child to the grandchild like this. Here you go. And then we want to move the code to receive the event from here to the child as well. And then we're gonna just print it out as child. You just have to change the code to fire the event a little bit in the grandchild as well, because right now it follows the syntax for your application event. So let me just change that. Component.get event, and the event name is gonna be CMP event. And then let me check what our attributes name was so that we don't have things not working. Uh, yep, that is our custom. Okay, so it was called event info. Let me change it everywhere in my references. All right, that's it. Then the grandchild as well. Okay. Now let me go back to my application and preview it. So let me change the button label as well. So let me just quickly review what we did right here. So now this button that you guys see here is on the grandchild. That is this third component level. So right now it's gonna fire an component event which is gonna travel in the hierarchy. So let us go and check how the hierarchy works. So you can see I clicked on this button. So first alert that we get is the grandchild. Then we get the child. And then we get the parent. So this means that the event first went to your grandchild itself, because you can see right here we are firing the event from the grandchild, but we are also handling the same event in the grandchild. So the first alert that showed up was from the grandchild, then our event moved upwards to the child, and then lastly it moved to the root component, that was the parent. So this seems like that this works like this bubble phase. I mean, right now it is working like the bubble phase. So how do we make it work like the capture phase? So let me show you guys how you can do that. So the only thing, if you want to use a particular phase, is in all your aura handlers, there's additional tag called phase, and you can specify what type of phase you want to use, your capture phase or your bubble phase. So let me change the phases to capture. Same thing here, and same thing in my grandchild as well. Now I go back to my example, refresh it. So now the events, since we are only handling the capture phase, the event will be received in the capture phase order. So now when I click this button, so the first alert that we see is from our parent, that is the topmost component, then the child, and then the grandchild. So pretty easy, right? If you want to handle the capture phase, you just specify the capture phase in here in your handlers. So in the case of component events, if you don't specify any phase value, it works in the bubble phase by default. So that is why we were getting it from top to bottom previously when we hadn't specified any phase, but I can also specify bubble phase explicitly like this in my grandchild, in my child, and in my parent as well. Now I go back here. Now I click on the button. It'll again work with the bubble phase, that is going from bottom to top. Like this. Oh, I think we didn't only saved 3 components. Okay. That's why it was a little weird. But okay. Now it goes to the grandchild, it moves upwards to the child, and then to the parent. Now, a question might be rising into your, I mean, you guys must be thinking, what if we mix and match these bubbles? So let's say I handle the capture phase in one of these, like the grandchild, which is firing the component. Then I'm gonna keep the child as the bubble phase, and then I'm gonna change the parent to be captured as well. Now, what will be the order of your propagation? So let's check it out. I click on the button. So the first alert you see is the parent, then your grandchild, and then the child. So why did this happen? Why did it go from your parent to grandchild and then your child? So the first thing you need to keep in mind is we have 2 phases, the capture phase and the bubble phase. So the capture phase runs first, and only after the capture phase is completed, we move on to the bubble phase. So when the capture phase runs first, we're going to look at the components which are handling the capture phase, that is the grandchild and the parent. And since in the capture phase, the events move from top to bottom, the event was sent to the topmost, that is the parent component first. Then the event moved on to your child, but it wasn't handling the capture phase, so it skipped it. Then it went to the grandchild and it saw that the capture phase was handled here, so it fired the method, right? Then the capture phase was finished. Then the framework just had to look for all the events which are handling bubble phase. In this case, that was only a single child component, so it ran the method for the child component. So once again, I'm gonna go back here. I'm gonna show you guys one more time. Was the parent, because the parent is in your capture phase and it is the root component, and the capture phase goes from top to bottom, so it goes to the root component first. Then it goes to, oh, I think we skipped it out. Yeah, it goes to the parent, then it goes to your grandchild, because the grandchild was the second one being handled in the capture phase. And then lastly, it went to your child after the capture phase was done, and we moved on to the bubble phase. So this is how you mix and match phases for your component events. Based on particular scenario, based on your solution design, you can implement whatever type of phase you want to. But here's a basic breakdown of how you do that. Now, let us move on to your application events. So application events are quite similar in terms of phases. So instead of having just two phases, capture and bubble phase, we have a third phase called the default phase in application events. And the good thing is the capture and bubble phases work exactly the same they do in your component events in application events as well. So capture phase still remains being moved from your parent or the topmost component to the one which fired, and the bubble phase is the reverse. The event moves from the source component to the root component. So again, capture phase goes from top to bottom, and bubble phase goes from bottom to top. Now, the magic of application events happens with this default phase. So remember, guys, we when we talked about how we use these, we just said that application events travel to all other events in the application. That was the main usage of application events, where you wanted it to behave in a radio broadcast sort of way. So that property is only inhibited by this default phase in application events. So if you don't use this default phase in application events and just use these capture and bubble phases, they will behave just like your component events. We'll take a look at that right now in our example as well. But just for clarity's sake, if you want the property of application events to send the event to all other Aura components in your application, then you need to use this default phase. Okay, so if I move to a graphical example of the default phase, so here it is. We fire the event from component D, so you will see it moves to every component in the application. It'll go something like from D to B to A, and maybe whatever child A has apart from these two. All right, so now let's take a look at the example. Again, I'm just going to quickly change our implementation here from my component to my application event like this. And I hope you guys remember my advice on not using a name in your handler in the case of your application event. Let me just quickly copy this. Here we go. Then in the grandchild as well. Beauty, easy, like this. Now let me just change the attribute name that I'm using as well. It's called event text. Like this. And I'm gonna change the syntax here as well. $a dot get e dot c my custom application. Oops again. All right, we are all set. So now coming back to the phases. So in the case of component events, if it didn't specify any phase, it ran in the bubble phase by default. But if you don't specify any phase in your application event, it runs in this, what I was telling you guys, this default phase. Okay, so let me go back to here. And just to demonstrate this again a little further, we're gonna add this button and this registration to all three of our components. I'm gonna add it in my child and I'm gonna say fire event from my child. Then I'm gonna also add it to my parent. I'm gonna say call it parent, and then I'm gonna just copy this logic and set it up everywhere like this and like this. So what we have essentially done here is, now I refresh this page, you see three buttons. So all three of these are gonna be firing your application events. This will fire from the parent, this will fire from the child, and this is fired from the grandchild. So basically all three levels. So let's see what happens if we fire it from our parent. So let's click, let's first fire it from the grandchild. And keep in mind that this is running in the default phase. We haven't specified any capture or bubble phase right here. So let me fire from the grandchild. So you see it goes to the grandchild itself, then it goes to the child, and then it goes to the parent. What if I fire from the child, the mid level? Again, it goes to the grandchild, then the child, and then the parent. If I fire from the parent, again the same thing. So what this means is, irrespective of where you fire the event from, it always travels to all the components, right? If I fire from here, it still goes from grandchild to child to parent. If I fire from here, it again goes from grandchild to child to parent, and so on. But let's now specify the phase, and let's specify it to run in the bubble phase. And right here, now something interesting will happen. So let me click on this grandchild. So it goes to the grandchild, it goes to the child, and it goes to the parent. All well and good, the same thing as before. If I click on this, so now you see it goes from the child to the parent, and that's it. And if I fire it from the parent, it just goes to the parent and nothing else. Why this happened? Because since the bubble phase only travels upwards, once you fire the event from component D, it goes to B, A, I mean, in case of our nomenclature, if we fire from the grandchild, it goes to the child and to the parent. If we fire from the child, it just goes upwards from the child to the parent, and it doesn't go to the bottom one. And same thing with the parent. Since this is the source and the root component, it doesn't have to move anywhere else. It just moves to it itself. Now, what if I change this to capture? Now, let me fire from the grandchild. So you say it goes to the parent first, then the child, and then the grandchild. If I fire from the child, it goes to the parent and then the child. And then again, in the case of parent, it doesn't have to go anywhere else. So you see now, just the order changed. If we fire from the grandchild, now it goes from the parent to the child and to the grandchild. If you fire from the child level, it goes from the parent to the child. Parent to the child. But the important thing of note here is, if you use capture phase, it'll still travel to the component which fired the event and not go downwards unless you use the default phase. What I mean by that is we fire the component event from component B, use the capture phase, so it goes from A to B, but it doesn't move further after B because it has reached the component that fired the event. I hope this makes sense to you guys because you might have to practice it out a little bit, but you should be able to do quite a lot of practice of your own by using your capture double phases. So this was it for this session, guys. I hope you guys understood. We'll see you in the next session where we will talk about certain more event methods like how to stop or resume the propagation of your events. And again, the topic of some standard events that we normally use. So see you guys in the next session.